Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, May 14th, 2025 edition of the SANS and its Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, and today's Stormcast is brought to you from the SANS EDU certificate program in cloud security from Jacksonville, Florida. And the highlight today, of course, is Microsoft's Patch Tuesday. We had patches for 78 vulnerabilities in May. 8 of them had already been patched earlier, but the 70 new vulnerabilities being announced as part of this release. Out of these 78 vulnerabilities, 11 are critical, and the number that's a little bit higher than normal is that we have 5 already exploited vulnerabilities that are being patched today. Now, out of those 5 vulnerabilities, there are 4 privilege escalation of vulnerabilities. And the sort of couple, I call them always friends of the show here, the Windows Common Log File System driver elevation of privilege vulnerability. That's something we had a couple of times before already. That's the old problem where this log file system driver is running with elevated privileges. It has to parse various log formats, and that often fails. So definitely something to be aware of. There was one code execution vulnerability here, and this is the scripting engine memory corruption vulnerability. However, this vulnerability is only exploitable if you are running a Microsoft Edge in Internet Explorer mode, because that scripting engine is of that leftover part from Internet Explorer. Probably do some configuration checks and such, make sure that this doesn't happen unintentionally. I can imagine where developers, maybe some system administrators that need access to legacy tools or such, they may need that, but it should be hardly ever where people actually need to run in an Explorer mode. You definitely should control that. Now, among the other sort of interesting vulnerabilities, we did have one vulnerability that initially sort of caught my interest because, it's Windows Desktop Service Remote Code Execution vulnerability. And you note here, it's only rated as important. It's not rated as critical, even though this vulnerability is exploitable without authentication. However, there's another big dependency here. It's a timing vulnerability, and it's only exploitable while the remote desktop service is being relaunched. On the same note, if you look a little bit back, there are also 2 vulnerabilities here, also important, that are remote desktop gateway denial of service vulnerabilities. So if an attacker would be able to trigger a restart, maybe with one of these denial of service vulnerabilities, then the code execution vulnerability becomes all of a sudden a lot more exploitable. That's a speculation at this point, so haven't seen anybody really talk about whether the denial of service can trigger a restart and whether it then becomes exploitable. Definitely something to patch, and as always, RDP is a service that you have to tightly control. It's one of the favorite entrance vectors for ransomware gangs, regardless of vulnerabilities. Well, they often just brute force authentication. Other than that, I think that's sort of really the highlight vulnerabilities here. Patch, nothing that I would call an emergency here, but always think a little bit at configuration changes and such. In particular with these repeating vulnerabilities, where you probably want to be ready for the next log system vulnerability or the next scripting engine vulnerability. Well, maybe Microsoft's 0 days today were a little bit disappointing for the attackers. Leave it up to Ivanti to make up for it. Ivanti fixed 2 already exploited vulnerabilities in Ivanti's Endpoint Manager Mobile. The first vulnerability is an authentication bypass vulnerability. The second vulnerability then is a remote code execution vulnerability. This, after you exploit the authentication bypass, doesn't require any authentication either. I think the CVSS score is a little bit on the low side here, given the overall impact, but that's sort of one of the difficulties sometimes, that a vulnerability by itself may not really be that much of a big deal, but once you look at them together and are able to sort of chain exploitation like this, well, you all of a sudden have a much larger problem. And talking about already exploited vulnerabilities, we also got updates from Fortinet. Fortinet patched a stack-based buffer overflow that's already being exploited and affects a number of Fortinet products. For example, FortiCamera, FortiMail, FortiNDR, FortiRecorder, and FortiVoice. And for all of these, several versions, pretty much all supported versions, are affected. So another thing that I would probably prioritize ahead of some of the Microsoft updates this week. Well, and that's it for today. Thanks for listening, and thanks for liking the podcast. Thanks for any comments and such that are coming in. For those of you watching this as in a video format, I try to add a couple screenshots of web pages and such to make things a little bit easier to follow along. Don't do that while I'm on the road, just because there's too many moving parts, and at home it's a little bit more setup that I'm using here makes it a bit easier to add this. Well, that's it for today. Thanks, and talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.